It's the mid-90s, somewhere, sometime in New York City. Whether it be your house, office, or car, you're listening to music on a local station like you would on any other day. And to set the mood, let's just say it's nighttime wherever you're at. Whether you're lounging or busying yourself, you're not paying much attention to the classical piece that's playing in the background. Then, out of absolutely nowhere, this begins blaring through your speaker. You know, I think a lot of millennials like me in particular who dipped their toe in creepy content online when we were a tad younger have a series of mental bookmarks when the topic is brought up. That early period of internet anomalies have this incomparable essence that only resonates with its earliest viewers. We all remember the hesitance of watching the Suicide Mouse video, the uncanniness of I Feel Fantastic, and more on par with this video, the Max Headroom incident. One of these types of happenings stood out to me the most when I first heard it, and it still very much sticks with me because of just how horrifying it is, atop the fact that, despite the theories, no one seems to have an answer for what happened. So, how did an otherwise normal radio station become associated with such an ominous and disturbing legend? First, let's look into the history of WKCR. Its inception can be traced all the way back to 1908, when it was called Columbia University Radio. When Columbia University students experimented with the budding wireless technology at the time, it operated on a short frequency back then, opening up a sufficient platform to learn about this type of tech. And by the 1920s, Columbia University Radio had gotten its feet wet with a more solid list of programming. And with the help of the Federal Radio Commission of 1927, the station was able to license itself and, in turn, broadcast to a much wider audience. Jazz, classical, local talent, educational broadcasts, you name it. Columbia University Radio was a prime choice in New York City. Come 1941, the Federal Communications Committee, or FCC, officially registered the broadcast as an official radio station, dubbing the broadcast WKCR, the last two letters standing for Columbia Radio, still giving it recognition for the university. Its inaugural broadcast was on April 21st, where it continued its usual programming, but now with a bigger focus on jazz taking over the airwaves. The station was paramount during the University of Columbia protest of 1968, one of many college-based protests at the time surrounding Vietnam and the Civil Rights Movement. WKCR, being a student-led station, took the side of the protesters and became the only live news source covering the event. Furthermore, the station even organized special operations among students that were able to override every lock on campus and disrupt telephone communications between administrators and law enforcement. These students actually worked their way through the university tunnel system in order to access distribution panel rooms. This way, they could bark their demands and make it to where news reporters could only communicate with the students and the students only. In short, it was a regular radio station with a rich history that had humble beginnings at a university, which many around the country had in the early 20th century. However, WKCR would become more well known for an extremely brief incident that occurred in 1995 over its airwaves. And as a disclaimer, I cannot confirm whether or not it's a fabrication, but I will give it the benefit of the doubt because of just how oddly specific it all was. Originally brought to the public attention by an anonymous 4chan user in 2013, A person came forward with an old tape recording built into a radio that the poster was using either in 1994 or 1995. They were flipping through channels in the area to see if there was anything worth recording, which is how they landed on WKCR-FM. On the tape, the user manages to capture the middle of a classical piece being played when the broadcast is suddenly interrupted by this. The nature of this hijacking is completely unnerving and absolutely disturbing. Out of nowhere, the screech of something comparable to that of a siren takes over the radio station like some twisted intro. Considering this to be real, all those who were listening to this broadcast must have felt an acute sense of confusion or even panic when the screech took over. Even to this day, it's one of the most haunting sounds I've ever heard. And if that sound weren't enough, the mysterious voice had more to say. The voice begins to mumble something. Names of people since past. One after the other, Frank Oppenheimer being one of them. Some of it's hard to make out, but after analyzing the recording, it became apparent that the ghostly woman was also reading off a list of names connected to a tragedy about 7 years earlier. For some bizarre reason, she was reading names of the victims of the ill-fated Pan Am Flight 103. We can't answer why, but we can answer what. The Pan Am 103 tragedy, also known as the Lockerbie bombing, occurred on December 21, 1988, when Pan Am Flight 103, a Boeing 747, was destroyed by a bomb while flying over Lockerbie, Scotland. The catastrophic event resulted in the deaths of all 259 people on board, including passengers and crew, as well as 11 individuals on the ground whose homes were struck by falling debris. Pan Am Flight 103 was en route from London to New York City when it exploded at approximately 31,000 feet. The explosion was caused by a timer-activated bomb concealed within a cassette player in a suitcase loaded in the cargo hold. The explosive used was Semtex, a powerful plastic explosive that is odorless and difficult to detect. The tragedy claimed the lives of 243 passengers and 16 crew members. Among the passengers were 35 students from Syracuse University returning home for the holidays, which heightened the emotional impact of the incident in the United States. Initially, the explosion resulted in the deaths of 11 residents of Lockerbie, as wreckage from the aircraft destroyed several houses. The investigation into the bombing was extensive and complex, involving multiple international agencies. It was determined that the bombing was orchestrated by Libyan intelligence agents, allegedly as retaliation for U.S. military actions against Libya. The U.S. government and the United Nations imposed sanctions on Libya after the suspects were identified, but not ultimately extradited. In 1998, Libyan leader Muammar al-Gaddafi agreed to surrender the suspects for trial, which took place in a specially designated Scottish courts in the Netherlands. The most critical piece of evidence in the trial was a fragment of a circuit board found on the crash site, which linked the bombing to the Libyan suspects. The trial concluded with the conviction of one of the suspects, Abdelbasset al-Megrahi, who was sentenced to life in prison. He was released in 2009 on compassionate grounds due to health issues, a decision that was met with significant controversy. As tragic as this was, it's still strangely obscure that some ghastly voice hijacking a radio station felt the need to name some of the victims of this event. Either way, this is what she chose to read. She goes on like this for a while until her speech devolves into complete gibberish, sounding as if she's reading from an ancient tome. Then, the audible torture ends.
You're tuned to WKCR-FM New York, 89.9 on your dial. Colombian music is running a little late. It will be starting in a few minutes.
Gaining control of the station again, the host speaks into the microphone, apologizing for the delay, and moving on with the broadcast as normal. It's a story for a good campfire tale or creepypasta, and perhaps that's all it is. But again, the true definitive answer is still up in the air. Why WKCR? And why the Pan Am 103 tragedy? Why so many years later? What's the significance? True, there is no shortage of strange and avant-garde projects, and that doesn't exclude signal hijackings. The Max Headroom incident of 1987 is likely the most relatable example, but there have been other versions, such as the Vrillon hijacking of 1977, that served as a bizarre form of protest. But this one serves no purpose. If it's a macabre art project the hacker intended to display, they definitely succeeded in conveying panic and despair. But the message, whatever it was, falls on deaf ears. If it's a form of protest, well, your guess is as good as mine. If you can count this as a clue, many over the years have made notes that the host who chimes in after the hijacking sounds oddly similar to the woman who read off the names.
You're tuned to WKCR-FM New York, 89.9 on your dial. Colombian music is running a little late. It will be starting in a few minutes.
I don't know. Nothing about this makes sense. No dots connect. Nothing lines up. And that's particularly the reason why this case has always intrigued me. And considering the call wasn't coming from inside the house at the end of the day, the process of hijacking a radio station isn't exactly the easiest task. Considering someone had the know-how to tap in, they'd first need to determine WKCR's operating frequency, likely in the public FCC records, find out the type of transmission equipment used at WKCR, like transmitter type and modulation method. They'd have to route audio sources, microphone/USB player, into the transmitter, use a mixer to manage sound levels and ensure clarity of the broadcast, and make real-time adjustments to the frequency of power output based on the station's interference, keeping an eye on feedback quality. Frankly, it's a complicated process to handle remotely, but in that same breath, it would have been much easier to pull off something like this in the 90s when analog technology was still king than it would be today in the digital age. On the other hand, there's the angle that the hijackers somehow worked their way into the station's booth, which probably had minimal security, and pulled off the takeover before being caught. If you take into consideration that this was either on or after midnight, I'd suspect the hijacker's success rate would have been that much higher. All that being said, my chips are on this being a remote hack more than anything. And beyond the host's apology, there was no statement released about the interruption, no documentation to refer to by the university or the FCC. It's for this reason that both casts doubt on its legitimacy, but at the same time, inflates it into the legend it already is. WKCR's transmitter was destroyed during the September 11th terrorist attacks, as the station was one of 4 in New York that transmitted from the World Trade Center. For the following 2 years, the station operated using its backup transmitter located on top of Carman Hall. This limited its broadcasting range significantly, with the signal broadcast struggling to extend beyond a 20-mile radius. In 2003, however, the station successfully installed a new antenna at 4 Times Square, where it continued to transmit. WKCR 89.9 FM New York still broadcasts today, continuing its tradition of offering a diverse palette of programming: jazz, classical, educational content, and much, much more. You'd think that a college radio station with such a rich history dating back more than 100 years would elicit more thoughts pertaining to knowledge and music history. But thanks to the power of the World Wide Web, many of us think of one thing when WKCR is brought up in conversation. What was that? Why were those names spoken? Who was that woman? And what was the point of the broadcast? To add my own personal credence to the internet legend, I do find it interesting with just how specific the details from the original poster provide. Some New York University station in the 90s? The references to a tragedy that happened nearly a decade earlier in another country? It's such an obscure mystery, and yet there are no concrete answers. It could very well be a fabrication, one of many from internet forums like 4chan. But not many can provide media like compelling audio recovered from the tape recorder that was posted in 2013. At the making of this video, the answer is still up in the air, and it's up to you to make that determination. With that being said, what are your theories on the hijacking of WKCR-FM?